Hello, this is Joe Polish, president of Piranha Marketing and founder of the Genius Network interview series, and you're about to hear one of my Genius Network interviews, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and I hope you find it very useful. If you want to find out more information about some of the interviews and resources that can help you in your business, you can go to www.joepolish.com. And we have a Joe Polish Recommends section with all kinds of resources and vendors and services and products that we recommend that can help you in your business. And also for more useful interviews and a whole list of other people that I've interviewed, you can go to www.geniusnetwork.com. Thanks and enjoy the interview.
Hello, this is Joe Polish, and I want to welcome you to another edition of the Genius Network interview series. And today I've got Mr. Paul Colligan on the line. Paul, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Can you hear me, Joe?
I can hear you. Wonderful.
There we go.
You know what's funny? We're over the phone right now doing this Genius Network interview, but we're going to talk about something that is really pretty much done a lot online, and that's the subject of podcasting. This is a subject that I've never done an interview on. It's something that some people are very familiar with, and other people are like, what? What did you just say? At the time of this recording, podcasting is, really brand new to a lot of people, and they know nothing about it. So the subject of this interview is what is podcasting, and is there money in it, and what should every entrepreneur know about this interesting thing called podcasting. So, Paul, I'm going to read just parts of your biography that's right off of your website, paulcolligan.com, and anything that I leave out I want you to mention, and then we'll get right into the meat and potatoes of this, okay?
Go for it.
All right, so this is supposed to make you sound really like a very special person. So Paul Colligan is the CEO of Colligan.com, that's Colligan.com, an online provider of consulting technologies and web properties for Internet marketing. He's also the webmaster of several popular Internet marketing sites that include Podcast Tools, the My Podcast Center Podcast Directory, Front Page World, Affiliate Marketing World, and You Can Sell Online. Paul also runs the AutomaticSales.com and FrontPageCart.com e-commerce engines to help businesses get their e-commerce programs up and running quickly. Mr. Colligan has played a key role in the launch of dozens of financially successful websites and Internet marketing strategies that have seen millions of visitors and millions of dollars in revenue. And previous clients have included all kinds of people. I won't name them all. If you want to mention any of them in particular, you can do that. You're also a very popular presenter on Internet technology topics, and you frequently speak online, on the air, and before audiences about your passions. And he's also presented at events around the world, some very big events. You even spoke at my boot camp recently just about this subject, which was the first time that people even heard of podcasting. You live in Portland, Oregon, with your wife and daughters, and you enjoy all kinds of stuff that normal people should enjoy, which is hiking, theater, music, fine dining, and travel. And last but not least, you also enjoy something that most people, including myself, don't know very much about in the business realm, which is podcasting. So what did I say or not say that you need to give the listeners any sort of background so they have an idea of who the heck am I interviewing today?
Hey, you've got enough.
Okay, good. Well,
it's all there.
I will say this before we get started. I'm going to play the dumb interviewer on this role, and some people will say, yeah, Joe is the dumb interviewer. This is a subject, although because of you, I have my own podcast that has been listened to by thousands of people. I'm one of the very first marketing people in the world that have put up a podcast. We're launching with Alex Mandossian very shortly from the time this interview is being recorded, the world's most expensive podcast, which is a $10,000 podcast, which we'll talk a little bit about later in this interview. What I do want to let the listeners know, in spite of the fact that I am doing podcasting and it's out there, this comes as a result of you and your assistants. You're one of these individuals that clearly sees and believes that this is not only a big thing, but is going to be a very huge vehicle for communication and information. And you go to the conferences, you live, eat, and breathe this stuff, and you are the perfect person for me to be interviewing about this particular subject, just to give all the entrepreneurs out there some insight. So my first question to you, Paul, is what is a podcast? Let's just start from the very beginning, and we'll go through it.
Podcast is really just three things, Joe. And with all the hype and all the hoopla and all the excitement, people really need to come back down to earth and realize that it's just three things. Number one, it's a digital file located online. Now, I say digital file and not a music file or an MP3 file because that's really important. It can be an audio file. It could be a video file. It could be a game. It could be a PDF. It could be a Word document. It could be anything. It's just a file located online. Now, 99% of your podcasts are digital audio, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, why that's important. Right now, you're starting to see some interest in the video podcasting world. That's more interest than it really is effective at this point. But A, it's a digital file online. B, it is another file online that explains where those files are located. And that's important because, we can put files online, but if we don't tell anybody where those files are located, nobody knows how to get it. And then, of course, the third thing that makes it really important is it's a piece of software that basically subscribes to the file that says where everything is and just pulls down stuff as it's made available. Now, how is this different than other things? Well, you can put up an MP3 file of the latest Genius Network interview. Right. And you could email everybody and say, hey, guys, the latest copy of, the Genius interview is available, joepolish.com/interview03.mp3. What a podcast would be you would update the special RSS file that explains where it is, and anybody who subscribed to your podcast, their computer would check once a day, multiple times a day, depending on how they set it up, and it would check to see if there is anything new. The second they realized there was something new, they would pull it down automatically. It's not streaming. It's not radio. It's just the file that's pulled down automatically. Some people will then listen to it on a computer. Some people will put it on an MP3 player, take it with them to the gym. Some people will burn it on a CD, take it in the car. Others will put it on, an MP3 player, take it on the airplane, listen to it on their laptop on the airplane. The great thing is once you have that file, you don't have to be connected to the Internet anymore to listen to it. You don't have to be attached to any website to enjoy the content. It's yours to listen to when and where and how you please. If part of it bores you, fast forward. If you want to hear something again, hit rewind. If you want to just, skip over the whole thing because it was a topic that you didn't care about, you can do that. You don't have to stay through an entire, teleconference or something like that. You as the listener are in control.
Gotcha. Well, okay, so let me back up a little bit then and say, why is it called podcast? Everyone, unless they're in a closet, knows what an iPod is, or at least has heard of an iPod, and many of the people listening own iPods or various MP3 players. But podcast, what's the difference between a podcast and, say, a radio broadcast, listening to something on the radio or, say, like a XM radio or Sirius or any of those things? What does podcast mean? Where did the name come from? Why do they call it that?
Great question. And the funny thing is, they were trying to figure out a name for this for a long time. And people were trying different names. Time-shifted, RSS-retrieved content was a popular term for a little while. People needed just a phrase you could wrap around this whole process. And they picked the term podcast largely because Apple has an 80% penetration in the portable media player world. If you get 10 people in a room who have a portable MP3 player, 8 of them have an iPod. That's just the statistics. So people just came up with the term podcast because it made sense. It's basically broadcasting to your iPod for all sakes and purposes. When I overnight something, I'll say, hey, can you FedEx this out? My assistant might take it and find out that UPS is cheaper, and she knows what I meant. It's not FedEx versus UPS. It's just get that thing out overnight. And so podcast is just the name that this whole technology picked up. It's just kind of what stuck. So nothing sexy there. Apple embraced it, which was, an obvious move on Apple's side because, it helps them sell more iPods. But they actually didn't embrace the whole podcasting phenomenon until about 8 months after it was invented. Steve Jobs was smart enough to say, yes, I want a piece of this. And then they integrated it into iTunes, and everybody's pretty much integrating it into everything right now. But the name just kind of came because it was just kind of what people invented for it. Now, the difference, this is the important thing. If you have a teleseminar every Wednesday night, or you have a radio show every Wednesday night, or you have a television show every Wednesday night, in order to participate in the show, I have to be in front of my radio, in front of my computer, in front of my television Wednesday night to do it. Now, I could definitely tape it. We've had VCRs now for, nearly 30 years, but we all know how easy it is to set your VCR to tape something. And even easier than setting your VCR to tape something is setting your VCR to tape, every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock type of thing. And so, whereas if I want to listen to your weekly teleseminar or your weekly radio show or your weekly television broadcast, I have to be there every day when you broadcast during that time. If you're doing something boring, I have to sit there and listen to it. If you have a commercial, I got to wait for the commercial to be over before I get anything else. Because with the podcast, I get the file. It's sort of like going to the movie as opposed to getting a copy of the thing on DVD. If I go to the movie, I got to wait for the credits. I got to deal with the screaming kids in the background. I have to deal with the sticky floor, all that stuff. But when I rent the DVD from the DVD store, I'm in charge. If I want to see something again, I hit rewind. If I want to fast forward the end to find how it finishes, I'm in control. And so it's different. XM radio, satellite radio is getting a lot of excitement because you can take the thing wherever you want to take it. Well, first of all, you can't take it on an airplane. You know, there are a lot of places where you can't take your satellite radio, but still, you take your satellite radio, you still have to be listening Wednesday at 7 to get the Wednesday at 7 show. With a podcast, once it's on your portable player or on your computer or burned as CD, you can listen whenever the heck you want. And that is just extremely empowering, both from the content producer side, because you know how it is. Whenever you plan an event or a teleseminar or anything, you're like, oh man, all the people who can't make it. Well, with the podcast, that completely eliminates that. And then at the same time, a lot of us make decisions on what content we consume, what events we go to, what teleseminars we take in, based on our schedule. And with a podcast, we can just go, I'm going to take this, and I'm going to listen to it when I want. And literally, that's on the airplane. That's at the gym. That's on the cars. Suddenly, a snowstorm has taken place, and which should have taken you 15 minutes now takes you 2 hours. We're in control with podcasts.
Okay, so basically it is a delivery system. It is a new technology. And, I have a philosophy about technologies as it applies to, business. I mean, take away entertainment and all of the, entertainment and content things that are not business related that can be done with, podcasting. I mean, there's 100 million different variations of this. Just from a business standpoint, my belief is technology is important, but you have to know which technologies to implement, because psychology is far more important than technology when it comes to selling something. And so for the entrepreneurs out there, why should they care about this?
Well, let's give a really solid example. At your event, we had a guy who couldn't attend your event, who wanted to attend your event up here in Oregon, actually, and he was quote unquote listening along at home on the podcast. And we had podcasted the entirety of the interview with Cameron, which was a fun one, who was also on one of your previous Genius Networks.
Yeah, and I'll say that for people that were not there, or have not heard my Genius Network interview with Cameron. There's a guy named Cameron Johnson, 20-year-old, just wonder kid that has made $1 million by the time he was 17 years old, and just is an amazing guy, very well connected, friends with very famous people from Steve Forbes and knows Donald Trump and blah blah blah. We podcasted the presentation that he was doing at my boot camp, so someone was listening to it literally, probably within seconds of it happening, correct?
Yeah, and because this guy was waiting for it, he was really excited about it. But it was funny, later that day, he had already listened to the content, consumed the content, and enjoyed it so much that he sent us a little audio comment himself. And that type of interaction, I mean, could you have gotten a special satellite feed from your marketing boot camp? Sure. Would it have been worth the money? No. Could we have broadcasted over the internet? Sure. It would have been a big technical headache, and expecting people to be in front of their computer exactly at that time to listen at it just simply wouldn't have been worth it. But by podcasting the thing, I was over in the corner. I had my Dell laptop and my Verizon phone, and we'd record the stuff, we'd edit it, we'd upload it, and bam, anybody who wanted to could listen to it. And hundreds of audio files from your event that weekend were downloaded from all over the planet for people who couldn't attend your event. So from the entrepreneur standpoint, there's two angles here. One, people were able to consume parts of your event who couldn't have consumed it any other way. So for the entrepreneur who wants to learn something, very important to embrace this podcasting stuff. But from the entrepreneur who has a message to get out, who has information to get out, no longer being confined to a physical location, no longer being confined to people who can hop on the plane and make it out to your event, or even no longer being confined to people who, can show up to your Wednesday night teleseminar series. No longer being confined as an entrepreneur, being able to tell your customers, hey, that's not an excuse anymore. You can get the podcast. That opens up brand new markets for the entrepreneur, and any entrepreneur should be thrilled with the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I wouldn't be doing an interview on this particular subject if I didn't find this to be one of the most interesting and what I feel is going to be one of the most lucrative new technologies that is out there. And I personally love it. I mean, I like my iPod. I'm an iPod user. I have a couple different MP3s, but I really use an iPod. And when I subscribe to a podcast, I plug the darn thing into my computer, and I'm a complete technophobe. I mean, anyone that knows me, knows that I am not very savvy when it comes to computers. And I figured this out. You go to iTunes, which is what I use, although there's other places you can, subscribe. And I'm going to ask you about those so you can talk about those. But I literally just go online. I type in what it is I'm looking for. If I like the podcast, I subscribe to it, and every time I go on iTunes, it'll automatically download the podcast, and if I want to have it go right into my iPod, it is right there. And to me, it's very interesting, and it speaks to the term time shifting, which I'd like you to elaborate on that, because if there's something I want my listeners to think about, if you could basically pick and choose, which you can, whatever it is that you want to consume, business, personal, entertainment, whatever, and you can time shift it. What does that actually mean? Because I want the listeners to get a real clear understanding of just what is capable now with this type of technology.
Well, really, time shifting, sounds like almost a mystical science fiction type concept of almost time travel. But if you think about it, it really is. Alex Mandossian, who we're doing the 10K podcast with, he has a teleseminar series that he's doing right now on Monday nights. I have a commitment on Monday nights that I've already had. I want to take the class, but I, quote-unquote, can't. But that's no longer the case. Because the teleseminar is being podcasted, I now get the podcast later on during the week on my MP3 player, and I listen to it whenever I want. So really, I'm in two places at the same time at Monday night. I'm at my commitment, and I'm also listening to the teleseminar class. And by the way, this is a teleseminar that I've taken before. It's sort of a refresher type of thing. So there are times when he goes over stuff that I don't need to hear, I don't need to listen to, so I fast forward through it. So what is a 2-hour teleseminar for most people on Monday night is about an hour and 10 minutes of review for me, usually Wednesday or Thursday afternoon. So what I've done, what podcasting has enabled me to do, literally, is to shift time. What podcasting has done for Alex is literally enabled him to enable me to shift time, therefore I can attend, and therefore, I can pay for the class. People say, well, that's a pretty bold word. Well, if you think about it, it is. America we used to have this whole concept of, everybody had to be at home to watch the 6 o'clock news at 6 o'clock in front of their television set. Or, the Ed Sullivan show, everybody would watch that at the same time. There was this everybody at the same time at the same place doing the same thing. We don't have to do that anymore. We can shift time and listen to what we want, when we want, how we want to listen to it. And it's extremely empowering from both sides of the field. And it's just something that I think, should be attractive to anybody, but especially the entrepreneur, because as you look at the competitive landscape, if you're teaching a class and the only time you can teach the class is Monday nights at 7, and your competitor's teaching the class, and he can teach the class whenever people want to hear the class, who has the competitive advantage?
Well, and also what I'm going to test with my members in the upcoming months ahead is using podcasting in their own local businesses, everything from local service businesses to doctors to anybody in any industry that has clients that they would like to communicate a message to. Again, I look at this as just another delivery system, very much like you would deliver a message through direct mail or through an email. This is one other way to deliver and educate people. And so in the entrepreneurial world, I'm going to teach my clients through example, kind of like what I'm doing today, where they can get information about my company, and some of it is free, some of it is a fee. And I'm going to get a lot of my Piranha clients to actually test and use this. So at the time of this recording, this is all pretty much brand new to me. I mean, I've been using it for a couple of months, actually longer than that. But basically, I've not yet gotten any of my clients to use it because it's so darn brand new, which is one of the reasons that I'm doing this interview with you, because I want to introduce my listeners to this. And there's so many different things that we could talk about. But what I'd like to do, Paul, is kind of go through a list of questions and things that I have written down for you, just so everyone could have a really good foundation with this, understand what podcasting not only is, but the different ways to use it and how they can, start the whole process of learning about this. So if they want to take this on as a capability and not only a tool for personal growth, but just a tool that they could use to, generate business with, that we can go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to fire some questions at you, and you can do short answers or long answers, and we'll cover as much as we can during this interview. And what I would like to do is have you leave the listeners, if there's any things that they should go look at, any sites along the way that would give them a better understanding, by all means, give out any sort of information that you think would be useful for our listeners.
Will do.
Okay, so what is a premium podcast versus just a regular podcast?
Well, the paradigm right now, the thing that has excited most people, and it's where 99.9% of all the podcasting is is the free broadcast model, sort of the television model. Everybody puts out a podcast for the entire world to listen to and download. And that's a great model, but when you start looking at the entrepreneur and the producer of content, this class that I'm taking on Monday nights, it's a $2,000 class. This isn't something that you want to give out for free. You don't want to let the entire world, subscribe to the podcast if it's, $2,000 worth of content. We're going to be doing the $10,000 podcast. We certainly don't want to give that away for free either. And so premium podcasting is a technology that I developed, and it is a technology that lets you use all the infrastructure of podcasting, but instead of everybody shares one address, everybody shares one source, each customer has their own address, basically, which enables you to turn off a customer if they stop paying. So what we can do is, we can bring 200 people onto the $10,000 podcast, and if customer number 178 decides it's not worth it for him anymore, we can simply turn off his feed but keep everybody else's feed going.
Gotcha.
I think premium podcasting is the future for the the high profitable content. You're going to be using it when you start sending these things out to your coaching club. You don't want to just make your coaching club content available free over the internet, or else nobody would pay the coaching fees, obviously. So you're going to be using the premium podcasting technology. We're not the only ones who have it. There's a company called Audible who's building their own form of premium podcasting, and there's a company called BitPass who is forming their own as well. But I'm kind of akin to the one I built, but, who can blame me, huh?
Right, of course. You self-promotional guy, you.
Hey, I do what I can.
Now, you kind of touched on this earlier about at my boot camp, how we were podcasting it, but I want to clarify this. Can a podcast be live, or does it have to be pre-recorded?
Yeah, the very nature of the podcast, because the digital file is online, dictates that it can't be live.
Okay.
And so you can't do a live show podcast. You can, however, the second a speaker is done, chop it up, make it available by a podcast. But no, you cannot technically do a podcast live. And if you have to do it live, then you're looking at, a radio or a broadcast paradigm.
Okay. Well, who currently is podcasting?
You would be surprised with the amount of people who are podcasting right now. There are most of your major television networks are podcasting news, are podcasting shows and content. NPR is podcasting a bunch of their shows. You don't really need to listen to NPR live on the radio anymore. You can pretty much get all of it by podcast. There are a lot of educational organizations who are podcasting. Duke University has put up a whole library of classes that are available by podcast. A lot of entrepreneurs who want to prove themselves in terms of their knowledge and their know-how have started playing in the podcasting arena. Weight loss specialists are doing counseling, via podcast. There are teachers who are trying to, sell their books that they want to sell one day by giving away a free podcast. There are actors who are bringing together their friends and doing improvisational theater by podcast, just to keep from getting bored. There are musicians. There are bands that are using podcasting as a way to connect with their audience. They basically record live from the road and a couple of songs from last night's gig, that type of thing. Pretty much everybody in every industry is podcasting in one way or another. Now, right now, it's only, one or two from each industry. I mean, the amount of marketers, who are teaching other people how to do marketing by podcast, I can count on my left hand right now. And any industry right now, except for a few, it's pretty small. And there are a couple of stars being born. And so it represents a very, very unique opportunity. But in terms of, is podcasting, more right for one industry than it is for another? No, not really. Anybody who likes content and likes to be in control of content is ripe to listen to a podcast. Therefore, anybody who produces content for such an audience is ripe to produce a podcast. So lots of people are producing them. Lots of people are making them. Some of them are lousy, but some of them are actually quite good.
Yeah, no, it's like anything else. There's all kinds of information available. Some of it's great, some of it isn't. This is certainly what I consider a very robotic method of communication, and everything that I do at Piranha is all about robotic marketing. So this is just one other way to be robotic. So how many people at the time of this recording are listening to podcasts in the podcast world out there?
Well, everybody has their own numbers, but it's in the millions, and projected is 60 million by 2010. And if you think about that, that's just phenomenal. But if you want to look at how fast it's growing, TiVo, which is the the desktop portable video recorder, sort of the electronic VCR, if you will,
right?
They've got 4.5 million subscribers. They turned on podcasting last week. Now, anybody who has TiVo can actually listen to podcasts on the same TiVo that they watch Desperate Housewives on. So, instantly 4.5 million people were made available to get podcasts. We're recording this right before Christmas 2005. The number one gift with a bullet is portable media players. And these people are going to get iTunes, and they're going to go, what else can I get for my iPod? What else can I get for my portable media player? They're going to start downloading podcasts. So, I see in the next 3 or 4 months, 10 million new people thrown into the mix. I mean, this stuff is coming very, very fast.
Very cool. Are there any sites that you'd recommend that people would go to, about podcasting? Because if someone typed in podcasting into, Google or search engine, there's a bazillion things that would come up. So what are some places you could point people to? And then I'd like to just talk about listening to them.
Sure. Podcasts.yahoo.com is Yahoo's search engine for podcasts. It's web-based, very easy to use. It's kind of fun because people can actually comment on the podcasts, give it a 1 and 5 star rating, actually, make comments. So you can do some searching, and when you find a podcast has a 1.5 star average, you might want to shy away from that one and look to the ones that have, the higher ratings. What's interesting with podcasts.yahoo.com is that you can also click to play on any of the podcasts. You don't necessarily have to subscribe. You can play and listen to a certain episode if you'd like to kind of get a flavor of the show before you commit to it. So that is one of the premier sites that I recommend today. MyPodcastCenter.com is one of my websites, but it is a directory of both podcasts and sites about podcasting. As people start to investigate the world, somebody who's interested in, let's say a plumber podcast, I don't even know if there is one up at the website, but you'd want to know both plumbers who are podcasting and, of course, anybody who's helping plumbers podcast. So that's kind of the idea behind that search engine. It's both podcasts and sites about podcasting, mypodcastcenter.com. Another good popular website is podcastalley.com. That's A-L-L-E-Y, Podcast Alley. It's a directory of podcasts. There's voting. There are some boards, chit-chat about podcasting and that kind of thing. I think those 3 websites will give you a really, really good overview of what's going on. If you have a iPod, you have the iTunes software. If you have an Apple, any recent version of an Apple, you have the iTunes software. If you don't and you have a PC, you can go to apple.com/iTunes and download iTunes. That's actually a free program. You don't have to have an iPod to use it. And that's a very easy way to search through podcasts as well. And it's kind of fun because you can type in, in the search Joe Polish, and your podcast will pop up. You're in the same engine that people can pick up, Britney Spears and Shakira. So it's kind of a fascinating little play. That's not necessarily a website, but it's a very powerful tool. One of the things that you can do with iTunes that a lot of people don't realize is if you download a podcast, you can actually burn it to CD. So for people who don't have a portable media player, and although those are really cheap, and I really recommend people pick one up, if you're just a real stickler, financially, you can download a podcast, burn it to CD right in iTunes, and then just listen to it in your car stereo or in your portable, Walkman.
Well, anyone that listens to my Genius Network interview certainly should have enough revenue in order to go out and buy a portable MP3 player. Or at least they're just certainly not following the advice of all the experts that interview on how to make money. But anyway, that's a little, kind of like a little, side sneer.
A little dig there, yeah. Appreciate that.
How does someone subscribe to a podcast, and do they have to subscribe? I mean, you touched on this, but I mean, you can flat out listen to it right on your computer if you wanted to. But if someone does have the portable media player and they want to subscribe so it lands onto that, what do they do?
Well,
how's it work?
You get what is called pod-catching software. It catches podcast for you, basically. And the most popular one is Apple iTunes. And again, that's at www.apple.com/iTunes. It's a free program. Yahoo has a pod-catching program. There's one called Juice. There's actually like 37 of them out there. It would be ridiculous to mention them all. But you get a pod-catching program, and you basically, there's a subscribe button in all of them, and you basically just subscribe. And sometimes it's done automatically. Sometimes you have to cut and paste the web address of the podcast, but each one of them do it, independently. Once you subscribe, then your pod-catching software checks whenever you turn it on, or if you set it, every night at midnight, or whatever you set it for, it goes out to see if there's anything new and pulls it down to your computer. Now, in terms of do you have to subscribe? No, you don't have to do anything. It's a free country. The difference between subscribing and just streaming it, listening to it live, is even if you don't have a portable player, even if it's on your laptop, if you download everything to your laptop, then while you're on the airplane catching up with some work, you can actually listen to the podcast. You don't have to be connected live. Maybe you've gone to the park or something, or in a cafe that doesn't have high-speed internet, and you want to listen to something in the background. If you subscribe to it and it's on your computer, again, you don't have to be connected to the internet. The second you do the I'll listen to it when it comes out live thing, then you're strapped to the internet, and then at that point you're not embracing the power that this thing affords you. I love it. You walk up and down an airplane, and my favorite is when you walk in first class and you see these guys with their $1,000 suits and their $3,000 laptops, right? And they're playing solitaire because they don't have anything better to do with their time.
Right.
Playing time is the ultimate in downtime. And these guys should have the best iPod possible, but at the very least, they should have some podcasts, on their laptops so that when they're playing solitaire, they're at least making themselves a better person. Podcast.yahoo.com website that I recommended. You can listen to a podcast to see if it's your liking, and you can actually subscribe from that interface as well. And that actually interfaces directly with iTunes or the Yahoo Music player. It's getting easier and easier all the time. But basically, you click the subscribe button, and then the software does the rest for you. One of the things from the entrepreneurial standpoint is I really like pushing Apple iTunes because you know what happens if Apple iTunes doesn't work? They call Apple. If they can't figure out how to subscribe to something, you know what they do? They call Apple. And so imagine having Apple doing your tech support for you.
Not a bad idea.
Exactly.
Well, also let me also say to the listeners that if you do not have an iPod, you can buy a ton of different MP3 players. I certainly recommend just go getting an iPod because I think just the company Apple, just the way they package themselves, there's something quite experiential about Apple, just as a company and as an organization. Secondly, just owning one will open up your mind and your thought process that hearing us or anyone talk about it is not the same as experiencing having something. And I mean, just, forget about what we're talking about for a moment with just podcasting, which is just a way to get information out onto this little carrying device. But just some of the ways that I use this in my own life. Every time I work out with basically my iPod. I have customized, personalized workouts that are now available through a website that I set up called LeanLife, LeanLife.com. And people can actually listen to, customized workouts with David Greenwalt is the person that I've recommended on that site for personalized workouts. It talks you right through working out. In the morning, I have a iPod alarm clock, so I can program anything that I would like to. And as sick as this sounds, Paul, yesterday I woke up to the podcast that you and Alex were doing on podcasting, because it was part of my preparation for this interview with you, is just hearing some of the podcasts that you have done about the subject of podcasting. And it's like right there. I can take this with me in my car. There's a little plug-in thing in my vehicle, and I can listen to anything that I want. And so, you can do all kinds of things traveling. I mean, the best darn thing I've ever done to make traveling more productive and more functional is having an iPod with me. If you're too tired to read, or you don't want to read and you just want to listen, if you're walking through the airport, you just put it on. I mean, it's tiny, it's simple, and I own a variety of different iPods. I have some that just have workout-related stuff and music on them. I have others that have, information and business-related things. I have a little tiny iPod Nano. I mean, these things are great. Now with the new video iPods, you can watch movies and videos and stuff on them. So there's all kinds of things that can be done. And now with podcasting, you decide what it is you want to hear, what it is you want to listen to, and you don't even have to, once you subscribe, it just comes to you. You can just forget about it. And you pick any particular subject matter, and as soon as it is done and available, it goes to you, and you have it. You have this little, it's like carrying your own jukebox around, but it's programmed to be filled with what it is you've told it to do, where you can listen to it at your own time, at your own leisure, whenever it makes sense. And so,
that's one part of it, and I do want to, thank you for bringing that up, because, if you can plan to take your drive to work or your drive out to the customer, if you can take that and change dead time to learning time, that's powerful. And that's amazing. Like you said, you jump on the airplane and you catch up with a podcast and get some education, even if you're so tired that you got to keep your eyes closed. That's very powerful. But let me give you a second power to it that I think needs to be experienced as well. Sometimes life throws you curveballs, okay? Sometimes you get trapped in an airport, for a number of hours. Sometimes you get trapped. I actually went to the train station to pick up a family member. And I got to the train station, and there was this announcement that, the train was going to be delayed 3.5 hours. It wasn't really worth going home and coming back. You don't want to spend that time on the road. What do? There's a cafe next door. I had an iPod with, several days' worth of podcasts I needed to listen to. I ordered a cafe, and for 3.5 hours, I caught up on stuff. What normally would have been me going into the little store and buying a copy of People and reading about Jennifer Aniston's latest, would have actually changed to me making myself better during that unplanned downtime. And you can actually there are so many hours of your day, and this comes from the consumption side, there's so many hours of your day that are completely and totally wasted. And if you carry around that little thing the size of a deck of cards with education to make you a better person, it is something that absolutely has to be experienced. And I think you're right there. And, borrow one from a friend.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's, people can hear us talking about it, but until you actually do it, it's an experiential thing that you will see all kinds of applications on how you could use this. And truly, out of I'm a guy that buys a lot of little things that, little gadgets, although I hate reading instructions on how to figure out how anything works. I'm sort of attracted to neat little things, and there's nothing that is an electronic device that has been more useful and more profitable to me than an iPod. And now with podcasting, it just opens up, a whole new arena of what can be done with it and how, and how it can benefit my life. And
so, a business associate of mine, I have to keep all the different MP3 players for, the business that I'm in. And he said, "Hey, Paul, can I borrow one? I want to see if it's right for me." And so I lent him one of my, iPod Nanos. And we met a week later for lunch, and he threw me a bag, and it was a box of the brand new iPod Nano in it. And, and I was, "What'd you do, break mine?" And he said, "No, I've got it filled with everything I want to listen to. There's no way I want to, give this away to anybody else. So I just bought you a new one." And, and that is exactly how powerful this stuff is once you get involved with it. And from the, we're talking about the consumer side of it, but let's talk about the production side of it as well. Imagine being in a place where somebody is trapped somewhere, at the airport picking up somebody for Christmas. They're caught in a traffic jam. Maybe they're in a long line at the store waiting to get something at a sale. Imagine somebody trapped someplace who normally is just going out of their mind with frustration, and you are able to give them content that makes them a better person, a better businessman, a better whatever. You give it to them on that off time when nobody else is giving it to them. Imagine the relationship you're going to have with them in the future. There are a lot of things for me to watch Friday night at 8 o'clock. But how many things are there for me to watch, Friday at 4 o'clock in the morning? Or maybe that's a bad example. But the fact of the matter is if you can start delivering your content in such a way that your audience can consume it when and how they want, you are going to have a special relationship with your audience that very few people have.
And yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I spoke at my boot camp, and also when I spoke during a keynote presentation recently to a bunch of carpet and upholstery cleaning professionals, which are one of my clients, I had a little portable speaker, and I showed a demonstration of how you can play testimonials in a home if you want to carry a little portable, and just the portability alone of where you can take the information, be it something you want to listen to or something you want to play for other people. I mean, it just adds a whole new element of presenting and packaging yourself. I mean, I look at all of this as just unique packaging. It's a very unique way to package up content and have it delivered to you, and time is of your own discretion. It's whenever you want to listen to it and whatever fits in your life. And so what I see this as is just expanding freedom of how we want to consume and what it is we want to consume. Okay, now, Paul, I talked about and mentioned I use an iPod, and I don't want to confuse the listeners. Does someone have to use an iPod? I want to be real clear on this.
No, you don't have to use an iPod at all. You can use any portable player, and as I said earlier, you don't even have to use a portable player. You can burn it to CD. You can listen to it on your laptop. You can do whatever you want. The iPod is just, quickly becoming the default, de facto standard, You can get a good one now for less than a couple $100. So it's what I recommend to everybody. But no, it's absolutely not required.
Okay, now before my boot camp, we did a bunch of various podcasts that were put out there at joepolishlive.com. That's where people could download the podcast, and there were people that either listened to it or subscribed to it. And then another question for the listener, does someone have to subscribe to listen to a podcast?
No, absolutely not. You can click to listen in podcast.yahoo. You can click to listen in iTunes. You can click to listen in a lot of the programs out there. But the fact of the matter is if you're clicking to listen, you're in front of your computer. And if you're in front of your computer, there are probably things you can be doing with your time. But when you're in the car driving to the store, really the only thing you're doing with that time is driving to the store, or if you're at the gym working out or whatnot. So, no, you don't have to subscribe, but you're missing out on a good chunk of the power that this thing, offers you and affords you. So something to think about there.
Okay, well, now I want to ask you about privacy. I mean, when I talk about subscribing and opting in and all the things that people can do on the Internet, for the paranoid listeners out there, if someone does subscribe, what type of information do they get about, if I subscribe, what do they get about me? If one of our listeners subscribe to a podcast, what kind of information do they get about them?
Well, because it uses the web as the, communication vehicle, it's basically, really, it's nothing more than what they can get if they come to a website. When you subscribe to a podcast, that podcast has what is called a feed, and the feed is essentially a web address, and that web address is given to everybody. So if you look at that web address, I look at that web address, Linda looks at that web address, we're all looking at the same web address. The only thing we can get is the IP address, and if you're at a business that has, the same IP address all the time, somebody could theoretically go back and figure out that, this company accessed the podcast. The person who has the podcast can tell how many times it was downloaded, and that's good from a statistical standpoint. But in terms of, I can't tell that Joe came in on Tuesday, downloaded the podcast, only listened to the first 5 minutes. All I know is somebody at Joe's IP address, downloaded the podcast. That's all the further I can really go. Now, with premium podcasting, we've got the system where, each person has their own feeds. There's a little bit more tracking we can do. But that's really good because if somebody pays $10,000 for a podcast and they don't access the podcast, we want to know that because from a customer standpoint, we want to be able to call them and say, hey, what problems are you having? What trouble are you having? The Audible solution, the Audible WordCast solution for podcasting, they are going to have it set up so you can actually know also which person downloaded, which person didn't. And so once you get into the premium arena, you can track a little bit more, but you really can't track anything else other than just what computer address they came from, what files were downloaded.
Okay, so it is safe for people to go and subscribe to podcasts. Okay. Yeah, that's really what I wanted to cover. And secondly, what you mentioned about having information about clients. I mean, there's two things that I want the listeners to take place of here. Well, probably more than that, but, the main things are, one, what is a podcast and how to go ahead and listen to them, and two, introduce them to this so that they can see the different applications if they at some point in time want to record their own podcast, if they want to start using podcasting in their own particular company, if they want to give it away for free as order to just give people information, or if they actually want to charge a fee for it, just like I'm doing. I mean, I'm doing a combination of both. And so I just want the listeners to be aware of this. We talked about iTunes, Apple iTunes a lot, and I again want to ask you, why does it matter to podcasting?
Well, whenever you deal with an industry, you want to deal with the 800-pound gorilla. And Apple iTunes is the 800-pound gorilla. I mean, they have maintained about an 80%, market share on the portable media player industries pretty much since day one. So, we look at your podcast. I looked at your stats actually just a couple of days ago. And 84% of your audience came from iTunes. And if 84% of your audience comes from any place, you want to treat that audience well, and you want to make sure that communication vehicle is open and doing well for you.
Yeah, and we're not talking just about a couple hundred people here. We're talking about several thousand.
Oh
people.
Yeah, pretty much every show is downloaded 1,000+ times, and so when 82% or whatever the number was, that means 800 times it came as a result of Apple iTunes. So that's significant. They're just the 800-pound gorilla. I mean, basically, when you have directions, when you help people, you should say, here's how you do it in iTunes, and here's how you do it every place else. And you just want to be aware of what the 800-pound gorilla is. It's pretty important.
Well, when we were doing my podcast, a lot of, and you were the first one that introduced me to this site, Odeo, which is spelled O-D-E-O. What is Odeo, and what does that have to do with podcasting? Because there's all these different things out there that people are going to come across and see if they get into this.
Odeo is a really fascinating website. It's put together by the same people who put together Blogger, which was the really easy-to-use blogging solution that came out a couple years ago. What Odeo does, and Odeo is the only one who does this, and it makes it very interesting. First of all, they make web-based playing very easy. And although I recommend, all the time that the people, deal with the subscription paradigm, there are some people who want to listen to it on the web. Odeo makes it very easy to listen on the web. What's also interesting about Odeo is they have a bit of a social networking aspect to them. And we can go to your show in Odeo, and we can see the screen names of all the people who have subscribed to your show. But what's interesting is we can click on that, and we can find out what other shows they're listening to. So it's kind of interesting. People who listen to Joe also like this show. And that is just a really interesting way to get the word out about what's going on and get an idea of what similar shows are and that type of thing. I mean, you can go to your Odeo page. Well, look at that. 90% of my subscribers all listen to this show. But then you go to that show and you realize that show has 10 times as many subscribers as you do.
Right.
Well, at that point, maybe you should contact that show and say, hey, can we do some cross-promotion, or maybe I can interview you, or something like that. So Odeo is just a really interesting way to get kind of a mini pulse on what your audience is doing. Statistically speaking, they're pretty tiny, so I would never say it was a solid variance on what's going on, but it's a really interesting snapshot, certainly worth looking at.
Okay, well, since we're on the subject, let's elaborate also on, you've talked about podcast.yahoo.com. What is that? Well,
Yahoo has done an incredible job, as branding themselves as the easy place to go to search the Internet. There are people who are still afraid of Google. Google's so fancy and so, important. Yahoo's just kind of, Yahoo's that, neighbor next door that you can always go to type of thing. And because they are in the podcast search space, that's really, really important. So as a result, you want to appear well and look well in the podcast search engine at Yahoo. There is rumor, as of, the point of the recording of this hasn't happened yet, but there is rumor that Yahoo is going to integrate podcasts with their search. And that makes it very interesting, because if somebody searches for marketing help, here are websites about marketing help, here are podcasts about marketing help, that's someplace that you definitely want to be. So
Absolutely.
Podcast, is one place. Google recently, just this week, launched their music search. At this point, podcasting is not integrated into it. So right now, the only web-based search engine of any merit or worth is podcast.yahoo.com. As a result, it's something you want to keep on top of.
Very interesting. Well, thank you for that elaboration on this. Let's talk about creating a podcast. If someone wants to create one, how do they start?
You produce a media file. I recommend an MP3 file because it's sort of the de facto standard of audio on the Internet. There are free software programs. There are paid software programs. You got to get the audio file produced.
Just so everyone would have a starting point, what would be like a way to do that? What would you recommend?
Sure. There's a website called yourpodcastgear.com, yourpodcastgear.com, and they have a number of different packages. They've got, the same high-quality mic that I use, at the more expensive side, as well as they've got a service that's just over, I think it's $247 or something like that includes a very good microphone and the Sony software for recording. It's called SoundForge. That's what I use in all my recording. That's what we're using to record this call with. And so you can get in for about $200 with a really good microphone and a copy of SoundForge. You can download, there's a free software program called Audacity, and you can get a $10 microphone from Radio Shack, and that produces MP3 files. It just depends on what kind of quality you want to look at. What we did at your show, at the event, you brought in a very expensive, very solid, very professional sound group who recorded recorded the event for you.
Yeah, I mean, hey, I would just have to brag and say my events are pretty darn cool. We put in the big bucks, and they're pretty awesome.
Well, and the great thing was, just from the creation of a podcast, all we did there was we told the guy, give me CDs of each speaker. So after each speaker came into play, I grabbed the speaker, I changed it to an MP3 file. You can do that right with iTunes, which is a free program. And then, we podcasted that up. So in terms of when we podcasted your event, I didn't even use any microphones at all. At least I didn't use any of my own microphones. So you got to get that MP3 file. There's lots of ways to do that. If you go to podcasttools.com, we've got a video series out there that shows you how you can actually call a phone number and do your podcast over the phone. There's lots of different options out there. But you get the file, and then you put it up on the website, and that's just done the same way you transfer over a web page. That's done with the FTP program. And then the last thing you do is you get the RSS feed. And that is without a doubt, hands down, the most complicated part of it. And what I recommend is there's a company called FeedBurner, FeedBurner.com. And what they do is they make the process of making a feed painless. They do it very, very quickly, very, very powerfully. They actually even give you some more stats, and they do it for free because there's some advertising on their side that you see, not your customers, but advertising that you see. And as a result, it's a great service. Podcasttools.com will walk you through the whole thing. I've gotten emails from hundreds of people who have gone through the videos at Podcast Tools and got their own podcast going. It's
Wonderful.
Really not that complicated at all.
Well, and also let me mention now, I usually put together a hot tip sheet with all of my Genius Network interviews. So any particular websites or resources or things that you feel people should look at, if you could just kind of keep a note of everything that you recommend and suggest as we go through this interview, I'll put together a list that contains some of the websites and various things that you recommend so that people could have basically the footnotes of this interview would be real helpful, and that'll be for the subscribers. It'll be available to them.
Great.
Okay, does someone have to have a special server?
This is one of the really important things. No. Any web server works with podcasting. In the old days of Internet streaming and Internet radio, you'd have to have a special server. You'd have to get a license from Microsoft or Rio Media, and that could get really, really expensive. Any server that you can host web pages on, you can host podcasts on. There are lots of people I know who are dealing with $9.95 a month hosting accounts that are serving all of their podcasts and doing brilliantly well for them. I serve terabytes of podcast content a month now, and I'm spending less than $50 on my hosting because it's just a standard traditional web server. So it's very, very cheap to do in terms of hosting.
Great. Well, there's other things that I've written down which inside out, but other people might be like, what? What does that mean? So is an MP3 the only option to record?
No. MP3, you can record any option you want. It's kind of like, I'm probably dating myself here, but it's kind of like the old VHS beta days. You could produce something on beta, but only a small amount of people would be able to listen to it. As you produce, pretty much everybody I knew who had beta also had a VHS machine, but there are a lot of people who just had a VHS machine. MP3 is sort of the default Internet standard for audio. You could do it in any audio file format you want, just not everybody will be able to listen to it. And since MP3s are free to produce, it just kind of makes sense to go with them. There's a very popular podcast called The Chris Pirillo Show. It's a geek podcast. He does an MP3 version and a Windows Media File version for the people who love Windows Media Files. So no, you don't have to do MP3, but for audio, it just makes sense for that to be your default.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned at the very beginning of the interview, when I asked you what is a podcast, and you talked about, it's a file, which is called an RSS file. And I'd like you to explain what RSS is, and does someone have to write RSS code?
Okay, good. Very important. RSS stands for really simple syndication. And if you think about it, that's what we're doing here. We're taking our content and we're syndicating it. And RSS is a standard, it's a computer standard for producing this type of content. And it's funny, one thing that always intrigues me on the Internet are all these people who feel like they have to write their own code. And I think it's just one of the silliest things in the world because, if you think about it, nothing is in the original code. There's always some other translation somewhere else. Your printer has a very special code called PostScript. Now, it's a complicated code. You could technically program in PostScript, to make something come out of your printer, but that would be silly. You use Word or you use Notepad, and these programs translate it into PostScript for you. You know what I mean? RSS is exactly the same way. RSS is complicated, it's burdensome, and you need to get yourself a program that writes the RSS feed for you. And there are free ways to do that. FeedBurner is one of the ones I talked about. there are lots of good podcasting programs out there that will write the RSS code for you, and it's absolutely silly to be writing the code yourself. You should be working on developing your content and getting your content published.
Okay, where should someone look to find that, or what do they need to know?
Well, feedburner.com is a great place to start. They walk you through the entire process. Podcasttools.com, we've got a video on how to use their system with your podcast. Joe, every podcast I do is run through FeedBurner. Your podcast is run through FeedBurner. I think the last time I looked at the website, it was like 20,000 some odd podcasts are run through the FeedBurner system, and it makes absolute sense. The great thing about these guys, believe it or not, RSS changes, and there have been 4 or 5 changes in the last 5 or 6 months, and these guys just made all the changes for you in the background. They did all the work for you, and that's exactly the type of robotic work that all of us should be involved with.
Right.
So don't write your own RSS code, whatever you do. And it's sad. I've met people. It's so funny. I've met people who spend 30 minutes making their podcast and then 5 hours writing the RSS code, and it's just the silliest thing in the world, because I can spend an hour making my podcast and spend no time making my RSS code. I've got twice the podcast at 1/5 the time.
It makes sense, and it applies to anything like that. They focus on the wrong applications and ways to use their time. So the point is, with this, I've learned very little of what it is I need to know. I go to the experts. In this particular case, I have great content that I want to share with the world. Some of it for free, some of it for a fee. I hook up with a guy like you that knows and understands this stuff, and, lo and behold, before I even understood what a podcast was, I was out there having, thousands of people listen to me using this. So, the point is, you don't need to be real savvy to make this happen in terms of understanding, what this is and how it works. You just need to know where to go, which is why I'm hitting you with all these types of questions. And, the thing I want to get the listener to understand with my objective here is I'm going to ask you questions that give people specific answers to things, but that does not necessarily mean you need to go and look this up. If
Right.
someone just goes to your website, they can find pretty much the things they need to in order to, start from the very beginning and get a podcast working.
Some people like to know what's behind the wheel and what's behind the curtain. Fine, that's what this call is about. But the fact of the matter is, produce your content, put it online, tell the world about it as fast as is humanly possible so they can download it and listen to it on their time. That's the podcasting process.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Okay, now you mentioned price of the microphone and stuff. How cheap can someone start this with? Is it from every option, from the dirt cheap to the elaborate? How does someone make that decision?
You could literally, and if you look at Podcast Tools, again, we've got the video series. I've got a video series that will show you how to host a podcast for free that you did entirely with your phone. And so in that case, how cheap is it? It's absolutely free. Now, what is it? Well, it's a podcast that sounds like you did it from your phone, and it can only be 5 minutes at a time because that's the limit on the free version. So you can do it very, very cheap. But, the problem with doing it very, very cheap is sometimes it will sound very, very cheap. And you want to think about that. If you've been downloaded, 2,000 times, maybe you can make it sound pretty good. Especially if the largest audience you've ever spoken to at any given time was, a Chamber of Commerce event with 50. If there's 1,000 people listening to your podcast, do the numbers on those people. So how cheap can you do it? You can do it as cheap as is humanly possible. The question is, how do you make it sound good? And that's one of the things where yourpodcastgear.com is very good because it actually, gives you different microphone options and gives you software that can, help clean out noises and pops and hisses and all that good stuff. So you can start very, very cheap. Just realize that sometimes if you start cheap, it sounds cheap. And if you present yourself as cheap, you go from there.
Yeah, and I will just say to the listener, what I'd like you to do, this is one of those areas where you can get so marred in the complexity of it that, you just don't do it. And I'd say, this is a starting point listening to this interview, and what you do after the fact is entirely up to you. Just put movement towards it and just go ahead and do it. Once you record a podcast, if you want to remove it in the future, you can do that, correct?
Yeah, yes, but realize that, people who've downloaded it, they have a copy of it on their computer.
Exactly.
So you're not erasing it from history.
Yeah, exactly.
It can come back to haunt you.
Now, okay, once you got one recorded, how do you put it up on a website?
It's done with the same program that is used to put a web page up on a website. It's called FTP. Very easy to use. Internet Explorer actually does it for you. And that's something I show again at the Podcast Tools website. but nothing complicated. You just transfer the thing over.
All right, Paul, what about, does it take a lot of bandwidth?
It can if you get a lot of downloads. And that is one place that you really want to think about because, this is part of the whole cheap thing. There are some web hosts who give you a very impressive amount of bandwidth for a low, low price each month. But then after you go over that part, they have some very, very, how should we say this, impressive overage fees. And so, if your podcast gets picked up, they mentioned it on CNN, or somebody mentions it in Business Week, or you get one of the recommended podcasts, at the Yahoo directory or something like that, you can see a lot of traffic come through. So as you begin to plan your strategy, you want to take a look at a hosting opportunity that, provides for overage fees but does it in a way that's pretty reasonable. I've had people say, well, I don't want to pay a lot of money. Well, if you have tens of thousands of people downloading your podcast and you can pay for that extra bandwidth for $20 more, if you can't monetize 10,000 people listening to you in their ear, for more than $20 worth, podcasting's not your problem. It's the business. So if you become popular, it can take a lot of bandwidth. Just plan for it.
Yeah, very good. And, you'd want to have that situation.
Absolutely.
I certainly do.
Every month we're doing more and more bandwidth, and I'm happier every month, as a result. And we pay more and more each month. And, I'd love to have a $1,000 a month bandwidth bill because that's going to equate to, a very significant revenue.
Well, okay, now let's say you do a podcast and you're not just perfect. Everything that you say, there's something you may want to edit out. So someone's going to need to have a process, a software for editing the podcast. So what's the best way to get something edited?
I really recommend Sony SoundForge. It's less than $100, and it's a great product for editing. It basically works like a word processor. And you can watch, the waveform, the waves of you speaking, and you can literally select out a part, cut it out, and, get on with yourself. And so you talk for a little while, you realize you made a mistake, you made a pause. You can actually hit a key on the keyboard while it's recording and put like a little marker in there. And then you can go in and you can just clean it up. And it has noise reduction, it has volume control, it has all sorts, echo chambers, all that kind of fun stuff. So you can add special effects if you want. Really easy to use. I think it's the best software package out there in its price. It's what I use with everything I do. There are people who swear by Adobe Audition. That's in the $300 range. And there are people who swear by the Apple Pro Tools product, and that's in the $1,000 range. I don't have, the sound engineer's ear. I have the mind and the heart for marketing. And so I'm not necessarily as, in your face on top of it as some people might be. And there are some people where, ultimate control over sound might need something more than Sony SoundForge. But honestly, for 99.9% of the people, Sony SoundForge is absolutely great. In terms of editing the RSS, I really recommend FeedBurner because what FeedBurner does is it takes whatever RSS you have and it cleans it up and it makes it all podcast pretty and it just does all that in the background. So whatever hosting situation you're using to store your information, FeedBurner will clean that up for you. What I use for a majority of the websites is I use actually Blogger, which is a free software program, to actually create the RSS feeds, and then I run that through FeedBurner, and so far it's met all my needs for me. A lot of the podcast production programs will actually produce the RSS feed for you. I just recommend that you, just let FeedBurner do it.
Right,
Do you get an idea that I'm a fan of FeedBurner?
Yeah, it sounds that way. It's funny. I own SoundForge and I also own Pro Tools on Apple, and SoundForge is what I have used lately, and what I'll probably be continuing to use because I see no other reason to use anything else.
Exactly. And is Pro Tools more powerful? Yes.
Oh yeah, you can.
But are the tools in Pro Tools the type of tools that you're going to use in producing your podcast? Probably not.
Yeah.
And if they are, get it.
It's overkill for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you've done enough podcasts in the very short-lived life of this whole podcasting phenomena. What do you need to do in recording a podcast to have it come across really well to an audience, to be taken seriously, for it to be, some tips on just really creating and producing good information?
Well, it's kind of funny. This should be just painstakingly obvious for a lot of people, but it's not. You got to take a look at the medium by which you're recording something. Right now, you and I, we can't be in Arizona or Portland together to record this. As a result, we're doing it over the phone, which is the way you do most of the Genius Network interviews. And as a result, your audience knows that, and your audience realizes that. And you usually start out the show with something like, well, I'm here on the phone today with Paul Colligan. And when you say that, everybody realizes, okay, this is a phone interview, and it's not going to sound like it was done in a studio. And so one thing you want to do is you just want to set up the content and where it was coming from. Flip side, when we did the podcast from your event, if I said, hey, we're at Joe's, $2,000 marketing bootcamp event, and then I recorded it using a cheap microphone on a boombox set in the back of the room, you could hear people coughing and whatnot in the background, I would just be, laughed out of the room or laughed out of the podcast, if you will. So the one thing you want to do is set up the type of sound that they are going to experience so they understand where the stuff came from. If I just started a really bad quality recording and didn't set up why it was bad, people are going to think that I might have had a bad microphone, or I was cheap, or I really wasn't invested in the process or anything like that. So one of the first things you want to do is just set things up. Hey, I'm here on the phone today with Paul Colligan. Hey, this is coming to you live from the soundboard at Joe's Marketing Bootcamp event. This is the first 20 minutes of a CD taken from so-and-so's home study course. You set it up, and you let people know exactly where the content's coming from. Once you set it up, then people will follow along with you. If you make them guess, if you make them expect, if you make them wonder, then they're uneasy. And that's just a public speaking process that, you want to take in the recording medium as well. If you peak, if you have really loud noises, you got to realize people plug these things into their ears a lot. So if the volume goes up and down all the time, if this interview here, if you and I aren't speaking at the same level, and every time I speak, they have to turn it down because I'm so loud, and every time you speak, they have to turn it up. It becomes sort of an interactive process. You don't want to do that kind of thing. So you want to have the podcast at the same level. What I recommend you do very seriously is you try as hard as is possible to stay away from the monologue. People don't like to hear the same person talking for a long time. That's why interviews are great. Could we have done this whole thing with me just, dialoguing from an outline? Sure. But by going through this Q&A process, it kind of breaks things up. Now, of course, at your event, we had a live from, the stage-type recording, but that was set up, and at the same time, these are pros who know how to do that kind of thing. If your podcast comes on a regular basis, then people know that they can begin to predict it. If people know that every Tuesday morning this podcast is going to be on my iPod, that's a really good thing because, they know every Tuesday morning that they can listen to it. If you're sporadic, you're not at the same time, people don't know what to expect, they're not going to put you into their mind share. They're not going to put you into their daily process. So, you can turn listeners away by just not setting their minds at ease when they're listening to the process, by not respecting their ears and their time. One of the very, very unique things that a podcast has that thrills me to no end is the ability to only take as much time as you need to take to get something done. If you distribute things over a teleseminar, your teleseminar has to be at least an hour. If you had a teleseminar of less than an hour, people would feel ripped just psychologically, even if it was only 30 minutes worth of content. If you have a CD, you've got to fill up the CD, and if you go over the 80 minutes for a CD, you got to fill up 2 CDs. The whole nature of most mediums, heaven forbid a radio show that has to be exactly 30 minutes or a television show that has to be an hour, et cetera. With a podcast, you can take exactly as much time as you need to be. Your podcast that we did, every single one of them was a different amount of time. When we did camera on it, it was over an hour. There were some other ones that were, 17, 18 minutes long. What we did was we didn't waste the listeners' time by giving them exactly what they needed to get, as long as they needed to get it. We just told them, hey, we're done with this part, tune into the next episode.
Well, I like what you're saying there because really the way that we're doing the $10,000 podcast is our objective is to do 20-minute segments. Each segment between me and Alex Mendoza, we're going to talk about a stick strategy, which is what to do, before, during, and after the sale in order to make the sale stick and to really bond with clients. And we're going to give real-life examples that are worth $10,000 each. So by the time a year worth of our $10,000 podcast is done, people have been literally given marketing strategies that are worth over $500,000, and we're charging $10,000 for it. So it's not the length of time that we're actually doing it; it's the fact that what they're actually getting, and we know for a fact we can deliver on that.
Bingo. But what we're doing is in the dialogue, we're telling people this is a 20-minute podcast divided into two parts, which will take home about a stick strategy that you can listen to on the way to work. We're setting it up. If we just sold a $10,000 podcast and they listened to the first episode and it was only 20 minutes long, without setting it up as to why it was 20 minutes long, they'd be pounding at the door to get their money back.
Yeah, exactly.
But once we tell them exactly why we did it and we set up the process and let them understood the flow that we're taking them on, all of a sudden it's a whole new world.
Yeah, and now if anyone wants to see information about the $10,000 podcast, where do they go?
10kpodcast.com.
Well, good. I'm glad. It's nice to know that I need to know very little about this in order to monetize it. So my listeners should really take a cue from me. I mean, which is true. I mean, all joking aside, I mean, if I can do this type of stuff, anybody can use the application. It's the psychology that's important, and through this interview, they're learning what they need to do in order to set it up. So is there anything that you've not covered about what would turn listeners away from podcasts, what you can do to make it easier to consume, or anything else you'd like to mention or elaborate on?
Well, any expert in a topic who's producing a podcast about that topic can very easily put themselves mentally in the position of the listener and just say, is this something I'd want? What would I want that can make this thing better? The brilliance of the 10K podcast is, it's 20 minutes a week for a year, and it's, immediately applicable. That's exactly what I want. I want something that I can listen to on the way to work. I mean, my commute is, a 5-minute trip down the stairs. But, the average person wants something that they can listen to on the way to work once a week, immediately act on it. That's really, really exciting. So as you begin to build your podcast strategy, just put yourself in the mind of the consumer, or heaven forbid, go to your audience and ask them, what would you like to hear in a podcast? What would be good for you in a podcast? And that whole ask methodology will produce some pretty amazing results. It's not mystical. It's not, crazy and out there. What does your audience want? Give it to them.
Yeah, pretty simple premise, and it works very well. And, the Q&A format is a great place to start also, just like we're doing here. I mean, if you have something that you could share, just have someone literally ask you questions and go ahead and answer. I mean, I love Q&A formats. That always works very well for me, and I think it works very well for other people. Now, recycling, you've touched on this, but talk about recycling existing content and information, teleseminars, events, et cetera. I mean, how would that apply to podcasting?
Well, repurposing content is very easy to do because the content already exists. We have Armin Morin's big seminar. We did the podcast for that, bigseminarlive.com. Armin has his preview called Teleseminars, where you can listen about the event and, decide whether or not you want to attend accordingly. Those teleseminars are time and place. You got to be there Tuesday at 7, at this phone number to get in. We were able to take those teleseminars, repurpose them as a podcast, and let a lot more people listen to the teleseminars than could have if they had to be on the line at a certain time. And then we set that up accordingly. The music starts, welcome to the Big Seminar Live podcast. We say, hey, in today's episode, we have a recording of last night's teleseminar with Joe Polish, where he talked about this, this, and this. Hey, this, Joe talks a lot. This one's over an hour and a half long. Wanted to let you know, enjoy the podcast. And then we fade in your teleseminar. And very, very easy to repurpose content, very powerful to repurpose content. With the events, as you begin to tell people about Marketing Bootcamp 2006, you could, send everybody a CD of highlights, but of course, that would take a little bit of revenue to produce that type of thing. Could you do a highlights reel via podcast? Yes, you could very easily. We took Cameron's presentation and we podcast out the entire thing as sort of a thank you for your audience to let them get a better idea of what these events are like. So yes, it's very, very easy to repurpose content, in a podcast, and many times very, very recommended. And I know a lot of people who have tremendous amounts of content that already exist that they're frustrated because it's just sitting there on the shelf, not doing anybody any good. Cutting that up, chopping that up, putting it out as a podcast is a really, really interesting opportunity. And I think you're going to see a lot more of this in the future. I'm currently working with 2 different podcasts that are actually recordings of teleseminars that sold a good chunk of change worth of money, a good chunk of change worth of product that we are going to repurpose as a podcast. And we're going to change the call to action at the end instead of calling the 800 number to make the order, actually going to a website to make the order, and we're going to see how that goes. So very, very possible to repurpose content. I would recommend, again, start the podcast out telling them what it is that you've done. This is a recording from this came from this CD, this came from this event, because people just like to be, they don't want to be confused. If they're joined in progress and they don't know what happened, they get a little nervous. If they join in progress, you can say, hey, this is the last 30 minutes of the presentation. To this point, you talked about this. Then the consumer knows exactly where they're at. They can breathe easily and enjoy the content accordingly. But yes, taking existing content, repurposing it as a podcast makes a great deal of sense.
Yep, great. Well, now I want to ask you questions about my favorite subject, which is marketing. So I'd like to ask you some questions related to marketing, tracking, and monetizing, making money off this stuff. So let's assume that the listener has a podcast. They recorded one. How do you let people know about it?
Well, here's one of the really interesting things. I want to step back a little bit before we talk about it. Realize that Apple has one goal in life, okay, and that's to sell more iPods, all right? The way you sell more iPods is by having as much content as is humanly possible for the iPod. The more content you can put on the iPod, the more of them you're going to sell. So we are at a really unique position in relationship with Apple when it comes to producing podcasts, because not only do we represent more content for people to put on the iPods, but in most cases we also represent free content for people to put on the iPods, which is, of course, extremely attractive. So Apple wants, and this is important to realize, and this is where part of the excitement and part of the opportunity lies. Apple wants people to know about your podcast, because the more podcast Apple talks about, the more iPods they're going to sell. So it's not like other internet plays where companies have to put in your listing to make it equitable and to make sure they put in everybody, blah, blah, blah. Apple wants your podcast. They want your podcast downloaded. They want your podcast to be looking good. They want people to be excited about your podcast because it makes them look better. Okay, do you see the difference there?
Right.
Okay, good. As a result, believe it or not, going to Apple and telling them about your podcast, if you go into iTunes and you click the podcast button, there is a button that says submit your podcast. And you click that button and you paste in the RSS feed, which is the web address for your show. Apple will take that in. Apple will tell you if there's any problems with it, which you'd want to know anyway, and then they'll submit it. The last show I submitted to iTunes, it was last week, and it got in 36 hours. And 37 hours later, I was starting to get downloads from iTunes, and Apple was pleased as peach to promote me. And that's absolutely different than all the other, internet marketing things out there. And you produce a press-worthy event. You got to hope that it's not a, big day for news. You got to hope that the editor who is, picking up your content is in a good mood. You got to hope that the editor who's maybe looking at your press release, is interested in your topic and you didn't use a term or something that, whatever. Apple, iTunes, it's completely and totally automated.
And I think there's something really cool about saying, yeah, I'm listed on Apple iTunes. I mean,
it's gorgeous.
To me, it's kind of neat that I, am one of the very first marketing people to have a podcast on Apple iTunes. And I mean, there's a certain level of bragging rights that goes with it too.
Let's go through the dialogue. Pretend you want to know about my podcast. Go ahead and ask me. Paul, how do I listen to your podcast?
Paul, how do I listen to your podcast?
Hey, do you have an iPod?
Yes.
Okay, iTunes, the software that came with it?
Yes.
Type in Paul Colligan. My podcast will come up. I mean, that's gorgeous.
That is gorgeous.
That is absolutely gorgeous.
Gorgeous.
And, it's something that you want. Yahoo, it's...
Hey, how long have you been using that word as a way to describe something that's kind of really neat?
What, gorgeous?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe today. It works, though, doesn't it?
Sure, absolutely.
You're gorgeous, Joe.
Why, thank you.
Gorgeous Joe, wasn't that a baseball player?
It could have been.
Shoeless Joe, okay.
Oh, okay.
Yahoo is number 2. What does Yahoo want? Yahoo wants to be as good as iTunes. Therefore, if you're in their directory, Yahoo wants you in their directory. And then it just kind of trickles down accordingly. So at this point in time, You let people know about your podcast by telling them, and they index you.
Now when my podcast came out, I had all kinds of podcatchers and various different websites that, and still to this day, I mean, I'm listed on, with joepolishlive.com. I'm on websites that have a language that I don't even understand. I mean, what does all of that mean?
What means you're a popular guy. There is also iTunes, the 800-pound gorilla, Yahoo, the second runner. There is also a website called indiepotter.org, INDIEPODDER, indiepotter.org. And what that is, and this is really interesting, this is believe it or not, it's an open source directory that anybody is allowed to pull from the database. So if anybody wants to make their own directory, they can go to this database and pull out that content and just put it and use it for free in their database. So as a result, when we submitted you to IndiePotter, all these other websites that we didn't know about, that we've never heard of before, they picked up your podcast and just added it to their database. Because, again, they want to be big like iTunes and Yahoo. And the more people they have in their database, the bigger and more important that they look. The whole thing's been turned around. It's at a much better place. And gosh darn it, Joe, it's gorgeous.
Yes, it is. Well, is it important to be like the first, in your market or the first to market with a podcast for competition-wise?
Well, what's starting to happen, you see this in podcast.yahoo. Right now, if you search for online marketing, you'll see 3 shows. One of them has 224 subscribers, and Yahoo tracks just the people who subscribe through their system. One has 224 subscribers, one has 16, and the other one has 2. Which one are you going to listen to?
Has the most.
Yeah, exactly. And Yahoo does that. Yahoo does reviews. If there's a podcast that has, a 5-star average rating and it has 200 reviews, you're likely to give that a looky-loo. iTunes just this week turned on reviews, so you can actually go in, type in Joe Polish, find his podcast, and review it accordingly. And we'll see, what impact that has. But I mean, if you think about it, Apple does want to have a lot of podcasts in its directory, but it wants people listening to the most, to the best podcast, and the only way to know what the best podcasts are the ones that are reviewed the best, obviously. So by getting in first and getting reviews and getting people interested in you, you're in a really interesting place. So I would really recommend that you get in, get reviews, get subscriptions, get people talking about you, so when the ratings come from that kind of stuff, you're in a position of strength.
Well, okay, let's talk about tracking. Is there anything else marketing-wise that you want to mention that I didn't ask you about?
Well, the other thing is we're still in a really interesting opportunity right now where podcasting is still sexy and it's still newsworthy. And so these days, a simple press release that you have a podcast, especially if it's something that you wouldn't necessarily associate with a podcast, is very likely going to get you press. And it used to be that way in the old web days. There was a little while where if you launched a website, bam, you got press about it. These days, you launch a website and people ask you what took you so long. And podcasting will get that way as well. But right now, there's a real unique opportunity to get some press accordingly, just for the nature of, and the great thing is the press doesn't understand this stuff. So you leverage it, the way we just talked about that. When the press person says, well, how can I find out more about your podcast? You say, well, do you have an iPod? And they say, yes. And you say, well, you go to iTunes and you look up my name.
Well, I mean, you just got interviewed by the Wall Street Journal reporter, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When that article comes out, that's going to help.
Okay. Well, now, once you're out there, how do you track it? I mean, how does someone, what can you track in a podcast?
Sure. With a traditional podcast, the only thing you can track is downloads, which is very important if you think about it. But realize that downloads don't automatically equate to listens. I have, I'm a little bit odd here, but at the house I have 5 different computers that are all hooked up to podcatching clients for one way or another. So there are certain shows that I might download 5 times. And, there's so many podcasts I'm listening to right now that, even though I've downloaded it 5 times, it might not even get listened to once. So, a download does not necessarily equate, a listen. Much the same way if somebody tapes a show doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to watch it, okay? So you can track downloads, and downloads is, it's an important moniker. If I have 5 times as many downloads as you do, chances are, I'm being listened to more than you are. Now, what I can, because everybody has the same address that they get your podcast from in a traditional podcast, I can't always tell, how many different people are accessing me, but there is a concept of subscriber tracking which is what FeedBurner does, and it's one thing that they do for free for you. And basically, every time a computer with a different IP address, and an IP address is just the address that a computer has on the Internet, every time a different computer checks to see if you have anything new over a 24-hour period, it'll count that as one. Some people are really aggressive, and they check every 5 minutes. So what FeedBurner does is they only count it as one. So we know within a 24-hour period how many people check to see if you had a new show. Now, sometimes people only check for new shows on Monday. Some people do it every day of the week. So you'll see that number fluctuate, but you can't see that number get bigger and bigger. And that subscriber metric is important to track. But the only thing you can track is how many times it was downloaded, and what type of subscribers you basically have within a 24-hour time period. Now, if you go to a tracked podcast, such as premium podcasting, because each user has their own address, you can check in on that user. When was the last time they checked? Did they ever check? And if they checked earlier this morning, that everything you put up yesterday they now have access to, and that they're at a good place. And that's one of the interesting opportunities about doing premium podcasting. The Audible solution, as of the recording, it's not in the stores yet, or not available yet to the general public. But what happens there is each file is actually coded in such a way that it's assigned only to a certain individual. And so only the individual can listen to that podcast. And if they can't pass it on to somebody else for free, but that person can go subscribe themselves. So you've got a little bit of tracking there in terms of, how many people, downloaded it versus pass on and that kind of stuff. It's not a specific science by any means, but if you think about it, it's really honestly a lot closer than the Nielsen's who pick, a couple thousand families in the country and say, hey, keep a journal. Can you track more about your listeners? Well, we did a podcast where we had a call to action. And at the end of the podcast, we said, hey, here's the product at a good price. And we gave them a website that was only mentioned on the podcast. It was never mentioned in a website directory, never mentioned by email, never mentioned in a press release. The only way they could have known about that website was in the podcast. And, we were able to get a good idea of how many, consumers we had there because they came out. The people who came out, 18% of them bought the product. If you want to look at a subscriber base, it was like 20%. If you want to look at downloads, we made 18 cents per download. I mean, there are all sorts of different ways to look at it, but you can track some stuff.
Yeah, and one thing that next I'm going to talk to you about monetizing. One great way to monetize is just if you start selling stuff. When people sign up for my boot camp as a result of listening to the podcast, or they subscribe to Genius Network, they just flat out end up hiring me as a consultant because they happen to hear the podcast. There's all kinds of various ways that I will and do make money from podcasts. And with the 10K podcast, we're going to have, because they will become actual clients, that'll be much easier to track also. But anyway, wanted to talk about it. So let's now talk about really turning all of this technology, this delivery, into money. So the famous word monetize. How do I monetize a podcast?
This is where it gets fun. This is the part that really attracts me. There's certainly an art to this. There's certainly some real fun here. I think there's a whole world in podcasting for the unsigned band. There are all those bands out there who just want people to hear their music. Absolutely thrilled with the idea that they can, do that by podcast now in a way they couldn't before.
Right.
There are a lot of independent filmmakers who just want people to watch their movies, and the ability to get that out via podcast. That's exciting, and I love that part, and I'm tracking that like crazy and having a good time with it. And I recommend that everybody else does as well. But at the end of the day, these unsigned bands and these indie filmmakers and all of us, we got to pay our bills. And that can be done. There's some really, really, really unique opportunities to monetizing a podcast that a lot of people don't think about or deal with. And I want to talk about 5, and there are some others, but I really think these 5 kind of encapsulate the different mentalities and modalities that are out there for monetization. The first one is what I call the audio newsletter. And I really think what we're doing there is what you're currently doing with the Joe Polish Live podcast. We are sending out free information to people who are interested in it. The same thing you do with, a traditional newsletter. Hey, to sign up for our corporate newsletter, sign up here. But you know what happens? Joe, when you get an email newsletter, what do you do with it?
either if I don't read it right away, it either goes into a read file, or it goes into a junk file, or it goes into the trash. I mean,
right. And how many of them do you read right away? Be honest.
Hardly any of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for that read later file, how often do you get to that read later file?
Yeah, well, once in a blue moon.
Exactly. So newsletters, but when a podcast comes to your iPod, what are your chances that you're going to listen to that?
Oh, yeah, much higher. Well, see, that's the whole key, which I want the listener who has not ever done a podcast to understand the difference between that and email is, this is so different than sending someone an email because, for one, it's not buried with 1,000 other ones in a distracted state. It's the way that I get it and how I get it that places so much more precedence and importance, and I guess even putting it into words, there's just something dramatically different about having a podcast sent to me versus just an email, even if it's an email newsletter from someone that I really like.
And you got to understand the consumption process of podcast versus email. I get up in the morning, and there are 100-plus pieces of email that I have to deal with, and this is just after all my filters and my spam and all that stuff is kicked in. These are the 100 that I have to touch. You know how much each piece of individual email gets? You know how much mind share it gets? I mean, it's delete, forward, delete, listen, delete, new, forward. It's that type of response. And usually, honestly, there's a podcast playing in the background. So as I consume, 100 different pieces of email, there's only one podcast in the background.
Yeah, and another thing, too, what I actually like about this, I don't know how much this will apply to most of the listeners, but, I go through stages where I just don't have email at all. I just get rid of it or I delegate it off and don't look at it, and it has to go through a filtering mechanism.
Yep.
I cannot imagine doing that with podcasting.
Yep.
I mean, I will, when I don't want something anymore, I just unsubscribe to it.
Right, but here's, you come back, you take a week off. I took a week off a couple of weeks ago. I came back on Monday, okay, and there were, lots of email that I had to deal with. And I looked at that email box and I went, I got to deal with all this email, and you have that mentality to it. Now, at the same time, there were a lot of my favorite shows that I had 2 or 3 episodes backed up. Now, it took me a couple of weeks to catch up. I'm still not caught up all the way, but I am catching up. I'm actively catching up, whereby the email, when I did the sort process, a lot of stuff got tossed that would have been tossed if I was around the week before that, but that's just kind of the nature of the stuff. Audio podcasts are consumed very, very differently than a traditional email piece. And here's one of the amazing things from a production standpoint. If you do an email newsletter, you got to make sure that's well written. You got to make sure that you've got copywriting in there, that you've got people who proofread stuff. It's formatted right. It works on all the different email reading programs. There's a lot of work that goes into an email newsletter that people don't read. Whereas as a simple podcast that's an interview between two people, with some post-production by a certified audio type guy, you can get a podcast out many times quicker than you can get a physical newsletter out, and it's that much more effective.
Right.
What would you rather be? Would you rather be in somebody's ear as they're doing the bike at the gym, or would you rather be, a 2-second glimpse as they're going through their email box?
Exactly.
So that's the audio newsletter concept. Very viable, very powerful, very popular. I will always be doing free podcasts as a result of the audio newsletter model. Second model. This is the one that everybody talks about that I think is one of the silliest ones out there. And when I mean silly, I mean silly. And that's the concept of third-party advertising. The whole third-party advertising model is, it's just like a radio show. I'll get ads. The amount of content you have to produce and the amount of listeners you have to get to make just a living with traditional advertising is so obscenely large that it's just not worth it. I don't even want to run, all the numbers on you, but basically, I was running a spreadsheet, and it's something like you had to have, 35,000 listeners listening to a daily show that you got 10 times the normal ad rate for commercials on, and this doesn't even include the price of producing it or serving it, and you'd still only make about $28,000 a year. Third-party advertising just isn't scalable, and it isn't financially viable, and it isn't honestly that fun. You will never see third-party advertising in any podcast that I do. And we'll talk about some of the next options, that might sound like third-party, but the traditional purchased advertising model just isn't really that exciting.
Well, and that's not to say that it won't be done by big companies and all kinds of things. You're just your opinion of it and your experience with it is kind of like it's the equivalent of image advertising. It just doesn't really have a lot of impact, and you got to have huge numbers in order to even make it work in the amount of time and effort and money that it would put into that. Just there's other much more lucrative models from your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's put it in perspective. Well, let's hit option 3, and then we'll do the comparison. Option number 3 is you monetize your podcast through affiliate marketing. And affiliate marketing is just a fancy way of saying, basically, internet paid commission sales. You sell something as a result of the podcast, you get a piece of the pie. And if you sell well, the piece of the pie is going to be considerably bigger than third-party advertising. When I did the Big Seminar Live podcast last round, we sold 2 tickets to the big seminar directly as a result of the podcast, okay? And that means that we saw, a $2,000 commission as a result of the podcast. And each episode was, at that time, listened to only about 1,000 times per episode. That means we made $2 per listener to the show because of affiliate marketing. Once you start making $2 per listener, now you're at a really, really interesting place. If I had done a traditional ad buy with Armin from the big seminar for that show, I would have gotten $30. So a traditional third-party ad buy, and that would be a very good applicable rate that most podcasters would be happy with. I would have made $30 by having a traditional ad buy, but by having affiliate marketing, I made $2,000 as a result of the podcast.
Right.
So commission sales as a result of your podcast is considerably more attractive than third-party advertising. Now, it might sound like a third-party ad, and you might have, a ad producer produce a call to action with, fancy music and explosions and all that stuff. But the fact of the matter is, the niche opportunity of a podcast gives you the ability to see a commission sales stream that is just going to be infinitesimally more profitable than just a traditional third-party ad buy. So, third-party advertising is option 2, affiliate marketing as option 3. And, of course, the only thing better than selling somebody else's product for a commission is, of course, option 4, selling your own product. And once you're able to sell your own product as a result of your podcast, you're at a really, really, really interesting place. We are making mention of the $10,000 podcast across every show that I'm doing, every show that Alex is doing, every show that you're doing. We're doing direct marketing absolutely for this thing. And we're going to see several customers at the $10,000 podcast as a result of this direct marketing, at a $10,000 profit per person who comes in on board. So when you begin to sell your own product, you're just at a much, much better place. And that's the 4th option for monetizing a podcast. And the last option, which actually is exemplified by the $10,000 podcast, is the subscription model. Once you can bring people to the point where they're actually paying for content, and good content people pay for. People will pay for stuff that makes their life better. They'll do it in a heartbeat. And the subscription model afforded by podcasting and some of the technologies out there makes it very, very doable. So number 1, the audio newsletter, that brings you in more clients, gets you more attention, keeps you, at the forefront of your audience. That's good. Third-party advertising is there, but I just don't think, it's just financially viable, let alone responsible. Affiliate marketing, direct marketing, and the subscription model is your last option. Those are your 5 monetization options. I recommend that everybody works on affiliate marketing, direct marketing, and subscription models with, audio newsletters as needed to bring people into their fold.
Gotcha. Well, very well spelled out. Thank you. Now, how do you communicate realistic expectations, say, on a premium podcast that you're charging for?
It's the same way that you promote realistic expectations in everything else. If you charge for a podcast, you better have the podcast come out when you say it's going to come out, and it better be of the quality and the style that you think it should be. If you tell somebody, hey, $10,000 is going to get you 20 minutes with Alex and Joe every week, and then 3 weeks passes and they don't get anything, you're in a really, really bad place. If you tell them exactly what they're going to get, tell them exactly what to expect, the classic, public speaking thing, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them.
Right.
If you do that during the premium podcasting model, you're in a really good place. I have a subscription podcast right now called, the Affiliate Guy Podcast. Get this, affiliateguypodcast.com. It's a $47 a month a podcast on affiliate marketing. It's paid, and we tell people exactly what to expect, when to expect it, and then we send it out accordingly. Once a month, you are going to get, a deconstruction of an entire affiliate program, and then you're going to get some sort of bonus material that's anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour. We tell them that from the very beginning. When it comes, they saw what was coming. You don't just say, okay, here's your address. Wait till you see what comes down the line. When you let them know what's coming, and you communicate with them accordingly. And remember, with a premium podcast, you have contact information about them. You have email. With the $10,000 podcast, we are going to, everybody who subscribes, we are going to send them out an email the day that the podcast comes out saying, hey, remember, look on your iPod, latest episode's there. We're even looking at sending out, fax broadcasts, updating people. Hey, look at your podcast. Might even do a voicemail call. We don't know yet. We're going to be testing out some of the different things there. We let them know that it's coming. We let them know to look for it. We tell them where to look for it. At the $10,000 podcast, we're going to have an 800 number where people call if they're having a hard time getting this thing on their iPod. For the audio newsletter where, faceless thousands of people might be downloading the cast, you got to be careful with what you can, give the audience in terms of assisting them and helping them. You got to be as robotic as is humanly possible there. But when you're charging $10,000 for the podcast, we can certainly have a tech support person who will follow up. And we're going to do that reactively with the 800 number that they can call, but we're going to do that proactively as well. If somebody doesn't consume the podcast, if they don't download it, if they don't access it, they're going to be asking back for their money very soon, and we don't want that.
Right.
So we're going to have a tech who's going to, look who hasn't downloaded, call them, find out how they haven't downloaded, and help them go through the process of getting that thing on their iPod or on their computer.
Well, and, I've been very careful not to spend a lot of the time during this interview promoting and pitching the 10K podcast. I mean, it's going to be amazing. It's going to be cool, and I'm going to have very elaborate, and we do, promotions for it.
It's going to be gorgeous.
What's that?
It's going to be gorgeous.
It will be gorgeous.
Yeah.
I will just tell the listeners, just look and watch what it is we do and how we do it. I mean, and model the things that absolutely make sense because, what we're doing is we're really leapfrogging a very new industry and how people actually charge for this type of content, and we're going to absolutely deliver in a way where people are going to be wowed out of their pants or out of their dress or out of whatever they're wearing, out of their robe. Anything else you want to mention regarding monetizing podcasts? Because I want to move into talking about the future of podcasting.
Well, the thing about monetizing podcasting is a lot of people tend to treat technologies of this sort in a very, esoteric, hard to grasp, hard to track type of world. They're like, well, we're going to do a branding play. We're going to do an image strengthening play through our podcast. We're going to put it out there to the world and feel good about ourselves as a result. The intimacy afforded by podcasting, the time shifting afforded by podcasting, the individual, unique, consumption modalities afforded by podcasting. I know those are big words, but the fact of the matter is this medium is so different than all the other mediums coming up to this point that it, screams for and deserves a focus on monetization that most people simply don't get elsewhere. And what we're doing with the 10K podcast, and again, not as an ad, but as an object lesson, is just we're trying to break, there is no limit to the value of the podcasting channel. The limit is to the value of the content delivered through the podcasting channel. Don't think that because it's quote-unquote a free MP3 file, it has some limits based on it. Use this channel to deliver, gorgeous content that people really, really want and people really, really need, and they will pay accordingly for it.
Absolutely, and we are also collecting a certain type of clientele that really, they want the absolute best of the best when it comes to stick strategy secrets. And, I guarantee that there's not another person on the planet that is going to teach more specific, tactical, strategic, easy to implement ways of creating a wow experience using stick strategies. And we're going to not only talk about what stick strategies are, but we're actually going to give people strategy after strategy after strategy that is easy to implement and is robotic and works. I mean, it will all be case study after case study after case study. So it totally applies to what you're saying with content. I mean,
and here's the great part. If Joe can charge $10K for his podcast, how much can you charge for yours?
Right.
We are trying to break the ceiling on any concept of a lesser value of downloadable digital content because it's just ones and O's. It should not be, how much can I afford to spend on my podcast? It should be a question of how much money can I make with my podcast. And the second you move to how much money can I make with my podcast, these silly little questions we answered above, well, how cheap can I get in and how little do I have to pay for my hosting, all those things go away.
Yep, exactly.
And that is, the big take-home for all this is, you can monetize this medium in ways this medium has never been monetized before. And if that doesn't excite you, go home.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's very neat. Well, okay, let's talk about the future. I mean, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure I know what the answer is going to be, but I'm doing it on behalf of the listeners. If any question they may have in their mind, is podcasting just a fad? No. It's obviously, okay, yeah, Paul, exciting answer here. Fact of the matter is this. Will it be called podcasting in a couple of years? I have no idea. Okay? But time-shifted, portable content that you subscribe to is the future of media. I mean, we already saw just, earlier this month, actually, the FCC finally resolved the fact that you don't have to buy all of your cable channels all at the same time anymore. They used to throw everything into one big package. Soon we're going to be able to get our stuff a la carte. The future is the consumer is in charge of the content. They can watch when they want, how they want, even what parts they want, at the speed they want. Podcasting is the channel currently to deliver that. Will it always be called podcasting? Will the iPod be the American entity that it is right now? Well, back in the 80s, the Walkman was the portable media player of its time. The Walkman has tried repeatedly over and over again to, knock down the iPod, and they haven't even come close. So in 20 years, will the iPod be, I don't know, will podcasting be the term? I don't know. But will portable, downloadable, time-shifted media be just a fad? Absolutely not. The day when people have to consume content at a certain time is quickly going away. I don't know if you've been tracking this at all, but Steven Soderbergh, the director who did Traffic, he did Ocean's 11, a lot of indie films, a lot of big films. He is doing a movie next month that is going to be released simultaneously in the theaters, on cable, and on DVD. And it's a fascinating experiment because basically he's saying, look, the consumer can watch my movie how the consumer wants to watch my movie. There will be people who want to see it in the movie theater with a lot of people. There will be people who, just want to watch it at home because it's available via pay-per-view, and there are others who want to put it on DVD and take it on the road with them. The consumer's in charge. So is podcasting just a fad? Absolutely not. Will it be called podcasting forever? Probably not. But this distribution of media where the consumer picks pretty much every single aspect of it is the future of media, and it just cannot be denied. Yeah, great. And I totally agree with that. So, what's coming in podcasting? I mean, what should people listening be on the lookout for? I think just everything that has been covered in this, extra long Genius Network interview on what I feel is a very important subject that I wanted my listeners to really hear all about. What should they be on the lookout for?
We'll talk about what's sexy and what's important and some other things. Right now, video is getting a tremendous amount of press. The video iPod, I showed you one recently. It is a gorgeous device. I mean, I have never been more happy with a piece of consumer electronics than I am with my video iPod. And the ability to take TV shows, put it on there, movies, put it on there, all my podcasts, all my music. I mean, it is a great process. It's a great device. Now, trying to watch an entire movie on a 2-inch screen that you have to hold in your hand that really doesn't even have a way to attach to anything is a frustrating process. You know, can you get a holder for your video iPod that'll make it easier? Yes, but the fact of the matter is consumption of video content on a 2-inch screen just isn't that exciting. You know, right now, if you travel to any Hilton hotel, their little alarm clock actually has a thing where you can plug your MP3 player into it. There is a video jack for your video iPod where you can have your video iPod play on your television set. Most people don't realize that. As that can become more and more popular, yes. Will people take their video iPod, watch shows, you know, on the hotel television set or a friend's, you know, large screen TV or something? Yes, that'll happen. But the fact of the matter is video consumption requires that you sit down, glue your eyes to the video, and, you know, get to work. Maybe you can do it on an exercise bike or something like that. But the way that people consume video is much less than the way people consume audio.
Right.
You know, if you think about the amount of hours in the day that you could listen to an audio podcast versus the hours of day that you could listen to a video podcast, audio is considerably bigger and considerably more opportune. At the same time, you know, the production of an even decent-looking video podcast is considerably more expensive than a decent-looking audio podcast. Will we be delivering future versions of Marketing Bootcamp, you know, as a video podcast? Yeah, quite probably. Will it be the majority of the sales over the audio version? You know, quite probably not. So video podcasting is there. It's exciting. One interesting thing that we're playing with is using the video podcasting channel or opportunity as a supplement to the audio podcast. We talked about the big Seminar Live event. The DVDs are coming out any day, and we're going to produce a short, 4-minute video podcast, kind of a best of clips. It'll be pretty much 3.5 minutes to you, Joe, and then 30 seconds to everybody else. And that will come out, and that'll be fun, and people can put it on their iPod, and they can go, look, it's video. But the fact of the matter is the majority of the stuff will come out in audio format. So video is coming down the line. It's there. It's viable. It's real. But if you look at the consumption of video over the consumption of audio, it's just not as intriguing to me at this point. Another thing that's coming down the line, I mentioned this earlier, TiVo just turned on podcasting. And TiVo is kind of a lot like the term podcasting. Will that be the phrase that's coming off everybody's lips in 3-4 years? Who knows? But the fact of the matter is a desktop box that delivers content, independent of the television stations should be extremely exciting to anybody out there. I downloaded a public domain 1940s copy of one of the old Superman cartoons, off the internet, and I watched it, on the same television set that I watched Lost on, coming over my TiVo, coming over the internet. It will be a distribution platform. Desktop boxes will be a distribution platform for people. The rumor, and again, at the time of the recording, the rumor is that the next Mac Mini will actually have an adapter to sit atop your television set. Will be the next TiVo killer. Who knows if that'll happen? Kind of an interesting concept. But boxes attached to your home entertainment system that get content off the internet for you that you consume when and how you want is definitely the future. The interesting thing about the whole Mac Mini combo idea is that, of course, it would have that iPod dock right on top, so you could tape last night's show, and then if you had to get on the plane, you could transfer it to your video iPod, that whole type of mentality. Home automation is definitely part of the scene already. It's going to be coming more and more. Congress just passed, I don't know if you saw this, but, 2009, I think it's February of 2009, analog television will be no more. It will only be digital television. And digital television means that content can be delivered over the cable, over the air, and over the internet, basically the exact same way. And so, the home entertainment media box is definitely part of our future. The last thing coming in podcasting, I'm a big fan of the company Audible, Audible. Audible is an electronic book on tape company. You can pick up any electronic book on tape from them, basically, put it on your iPod, and you can have, Think and Grow Rich right alongside with JoePolishLive.com. They provide the technology for that. Great company, filled with smart people. They are launching their podcast initiative very, very soon. I've peeked at the beta. It's gorgeous stuff. The fact of the matter there is it will be interesting because I think they're going to be the first ones, and I do mean first because a lot of other people will be doing this, but I think they're going to be the first ones to introduce a paid podcasting marketplace where it's not going to be, do I want Joe's free podcast versus Paul's free podcast versus Freddie's free podcast. It's going to be, do I want to pay $5 for this, $10 for this, or $50 for this, or do I dare say, $10,000 for this? And so I think Audible's introduction of a paid podcasting marketplace will be very, very much worth watching as well. So consumer content delivered, on demand through the channels and the vehicle that the consumer wants it is the future of medium. The old broadcast paradigms are very, very quickly dying. What's coming, it ain't just going to be low-quality audio. It's going to be high-quality audio and video. It ain't just going to come to, iPods. It's going to come to car stereos built into your car. It's going to come to TiVos attached to your home entertainment centers, that attach to your iPods, that kind of thing, and will always be free, or will be all these independent things like we're doing with the 10K podcast. No, you're going to see, marketplaces online for content as well. You'll see it first with Audible, but I'm sure it'll be coming from other places. But it's an exciting place to be. It's a thrilling place to be because the opportunity here is endless and it is limitless. And, I hope people on the call just realize this and, seize the day, if you will, and do something with it in their business.
Yeah, me too. And, well, Paul, that's about what I wanted to talk about. And I think you've thoroughly covered so many different areas about podcasting. And what I wanted to really, my objective was to give my listeners, direction, confidence, and capability in this new area where some were familiar with it and others, this is the first time they've ever heard about it. And so that's what I wanted to leave my listeners with, and I think you did an absolutely fabulous job. So I want to thank you, very much for taking the time to go ahead and do this. Also, I want to let my listeners know that everything related to Paul and podcasting is listed at joepolishrecommends.com. And that I will be promoting my boot camp at Joe Polish Live this way if you want to see how I do it and see applications that you can use.
Or they could go to iTunes and look up Joe Polish.
Yes, or you can go to iTunes and look up Joe Polish. And also, if you are interested in the 10K podcast, go to 10kpodcast.com. Check that out and let me know what you thought of this interview because certainly this is a world that changes very quickly, and I will certainly ask Paul to be really connected and plugged into allowing me to distribute to my listeners the latest and greatest things related to podcasting and anything that comes down the pike that I think you need to hear about. So any famous last words, Paul?
Well,
or not only famous last words, but any other final websites or ways that they could get a hold of you or to look at you. You're welcome to say anything you'd like.
Well, I've got a blog at paulcolligan.com, Paul COLLIGAN.com, where I kind of bring together all these different worlds. It's kind of fun. You can subscribe to it if you know that whole world. If not, just visit it on a regular basis. We do have a newsletter called Weekly Podcast Tips. Get this, weeklypodcasttips.com. You can go ahead and subscribe to that. You'll get both tips on podcasting as well as any announcements of things that we bring out. And all the other websites will definitely get up at joepolishrecommends.com, and I'm sure you'll do some mailing. 2006, the beginning of that, we'll launch a training program that you'll be hearing more from Joe about as well.
Yeah, and that's it. So on behalf of myself and everyone at Piranha, thank you for taking the time to listen. Again, thank you, Paul. I very much appreciate it. So not only happy marketing, will I say, but also happy podcasting. So
there we go. Thank you, Joe.
That's it. Have a great day or great evening or whatever time you happen to be listening to this interview, and I will talk to you next time on the Genius Network Interview Series. Thanks.
Hello, this is Joe Polish. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this interview. I hope you found it very useful. Please give me your feedback on all of the interviews that you listen to. I'd love to hear your feedback so we can always deliver a great program for you. Our website is www.joepolish.com, and we also have a Joe Polish Recommends section, so you can take a lot of the ideas and concepts that you hear on my Genius Network interview series and apply them to your business and find vendors and resources. You can go to joepolish.com to find that information and click on the Joe Polish Recommends section. And also, if you would like to find out about more interviews and invest in more useful Genius Network series interviews, go to www.geniusnetwork.com. Thanks, and eat your competition alive.